He is the Fastlane SDK's tech lead, and I am so thrilled to share this stage with him this morning.
Thank you so much, Karen. Thank you all so much. My name is Sunny Patel. Let's give another round of applause to Karen. She's really the cornerstone of Fastlane engineering. Awesome. Well, welcome to Developer Day. I'm going to deep dive into Fastlane, the SDK. But before I do that, I thought you're all engineers, you're developers. That's why you're here. Let's take you behind the scenes for what it was like for me and my team thinking about the API interface, and we're thinking about what methods would be helpful, what modules would be helpful to building an accelerated checkout. So I'm going to walk through, first and foremost, it was a greenfield project for us. So this was something that was brand new. And as many of you may already know, when it's a greenfield project, you're making a ton of decisions. And we wanted to get this market out, or this product out to the market fast as possible. So we wanted to have some decision-making guardrails in place. And so that's what I'm going to talk about first. Secondly, what were the use cases that kind of drove the decision-making? What does it mean to have an accelerated checkout page? I didn't know what that meant when I started, so I thought it would make sense to kind of talk to you about it as well. Lastly, how does all of that come together? How do all the pieces fit together to build a fast checkout experience for our buyers? Awesome, well, let's get into it. The guardrails for decision-making. First and foremost, we thought, okay, the buyer has to be in the driver's seat. Our job, our role here is to really just provide the buyer the information they need to make the right decisions. So the buyer knows what's best and stay out of their way once we've provided the information. Secondly, all of you, our integration engineers, merchants. We know that there's different expectations from small to medium businesses as well as large enterprises. Small to medium businesses might need something that just works out of the box. It's handling all these different use cases. It's kind of like a drop-in experience, but that has a different need from our SDK. Likewise, for large enterprises, you might have fine-tuned your checkout page. You might have done A/B testing. You've figured out exactly what your user base reacts to, and you need something that's flexible, that blends in. Those are very polar opposites. One needs ease of integration. The other needs flexibility. So how do we solve this problem in one SDK while flattening that learning curve? Finally, our Fastlane components. Well, this is a little bit different than what PayPal's traditionally used to. Here we're making components that are meant to be embedded onto the checkout page, right? So component encapsulation, that's number one priority. We want to make sure anything that's happening within the components remain within the API spec, and it cannot be tampered with. Likewise, for example, our CSS styles. We don't want our CSS styles leaking onto your checkout page and breaking things there. So we were thinking about how do we encapsulate these components in such a way that protects our merchants' checkout pages as well as the components. So one thing really early on we learned about is shadow DOMs. Like, let's use this built-in browser technology to encapsulate our components. Lastly, and this might be a really obvious one to you all, do not manipulate the merchant's DOM, right? I think you get into some use cases where you're like, oh, it would be really nice if we could do this, 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 and this. But it's a slippery slope. So we wanted to just put that out there and be really forefront about it. We are not going to manipulate anything else on the merchant's DOM, even though it might make it really easy to do so. Cool. So let's talk about checkout use cases. Now, you've all probably built a checkout page or two yourself, so you know that these are really common use cases that you're going to have to build out. These are really common features across all checkout pages. You might have a shopping cart, some promotional offerings. You're going to be making a shipping address. If you have international addresses, then you're worrying about different countries and regionalizing those shipping addresses. Maybe accepting credit cards because you need a way to accept payment. And then if you want to have buyers that have already checked out and kind of remember their profile, then you're probably going to authenticate and vote to that buyer. So these are all really common use cases for checkout. And so we're thinking about, OK, well, if we know that this is pretty common across all these different pages, what are the most highest friction points for a buyer? Well, it's manual entry forms, right? So anytime you're asking a buyer, hey, I need you to go and fill this out, manual entry forms. It's tedious, it's error prone, they might make a mistake, you have to handle any error messages. All these things are problems that you need to solve for. Same thing with credit card fields, right? They might not have their wallet or their purse on them at the time. They might have to go fetch it. They're entering their credit card incorrectly, whatever it may be. This is all really slow, tedious, and cumbersome process. Authenticating the buyer, remembering passwords, same exact problem. So now that we have these use cases and we know exactly what slows the buyer down and what we need to focus on to accelerate a checkout experience, we start thinking, okay, well, what are we really good at doing? What have we done before as PayPal through branded checkout and our other products, right? We know how to identify a buyer. We know how to authenticate that buyer. This is things that we've already done, pulling up a profile in a secure way. This is what PayPal does, right? And then there's other pieces, right? What is the merchant really good at? What should we stay out of the way of? We do not want any business handling. It's your business. You know your business the best. So we should not implement anything that gets in the way of you offering promotions, coupons, different delivery methods, managing your cart. Just run your business. We're going to do all the heavy lifting for the hard parts, and then let you do everything that you're already good at. So this is where Fastlane comes in, right? So if you synthesize everything that I just said, it really comes down to 4 main points. You want to look up a buyer, you want to authenticate that buyer, select the shipping address, and then select the payment. And once you integrate these Fastlane components, we are providing all 4 of those steps for you. And we're able to measure how long it takes all buyers across all merchants to get through these steps. And as Karen mentioned earlier, Fastlane is evergreen. So we're constantly learning. We're constantly optimizing these most highest friction points of a checkout. So we can continuously keep improving them, right? Now you couple that with the Fastlane network, where merchants are getting value and contributing to a network of recognized buyers, and you're completely changing the game. So this is Fastlane, and we're going to talk now, how do you bring it all together? How do you actually use these components, right? So I mentioned before that there's 4 main steps. Well, there's 4 modules. There are a couple other ones, but this is primarily what we're going to focus on for the next 30 minutes. So Fastlane provides you with an identity module. This is what you're going to use to look up a buyer. There's 1 method on that module, or sorry, 2 methods on that module. One of them is look up customer by email. Does exactly what it says. You pass it an email, and it'll tell you if the buyer has been recognized or not. If they've been recognized, then you're going to do trigger authentication flow. Just 1 method. You pass in what you got back from the first method, from look up customer, and now we're take care of the job of authenticating that buyer. Once a buyer has been identified and authenticated successfully, then we provide the profile module. So this allows you to then change or give the ability for your buyer to change their shipping address and their cards, right? And once again, there's just a modal that pops up on the screen as soon as you invoke one of these methods. And we present all of the UI, handle all the corner cases, the edge cases, the messaging to the buyer. All of that is built into 1 method or 1 module. Cool, so now at this point, you have a choice. And there's 2 integrations that you can go with, right? You can go with the payment component, which is a quick start integration. This is where I was talking about small to medium businesses just want something that's drop in, you're ready to go. So that's what the payment component offers. You get the same 2 methods, it's render and get payment token, but in this scenario, we're handling every use case that you can possibly think of. If you can think of one that we haven't, talk to us after. In this component, both guest and recognized buyers, their UI changes dynamically because all the components are stateful and they have shared states, so they know if a buyer has been authenticated successfully, so then the payment component can render itself in a different UI. Alternatively, you can choose the card component. So this component is there for that flexible integration. So if you want something that's completely flexible, you want to build your own DOM elements, your own UI, this is where you're going to use the card component. The card component just renders PCI-compliant card fields along with the Fastlane consent to allow guest buyers to know what Fastlane is and toggle that on and off. So in the card component, you are handling all the other use cases. We're handling just giving you PCI-compliant card forms so that you can go and render that where you want. you'll notice that both of those then components have the two same methods. And that's intentional. Once again, just keeping that learning curve kind of flattened, not adding additional complexity. So you can easily kind of switch between the two if you need to. Cool, so how do you use it? How do you initialize the Fastlane SDK? This should look very familiar to you if you ever integrated any of our PayPal components, like the PayPal yellow button. You'll have window.paypal.fastlane as a component that's available to you. And then there's some additional options that you can pass in. So if you're only shipping to California, Arizona, and France, I'm not sure why you would do that, but if you were, then you can pass in a ISO standard country code for each location that you want to filter down to. Right? So this allows you to then ship to only those locations, and our UI handles everything else, all the messaging to the buyer, filtering out the shipping addresses on their profile, and allowing them to enter another one if it doesn't match your criteria. Likewise, for the card options, we also have something similar, allowed brands, right? They're enums. You pass in the list of allowed brands that you're working with, that you accept, and then we handle everything else within our components. Lastly, there's also style options, and I'll get more detailed into this later, but this essentially gives you the ability to theme some of the components on your page. So if you have some branding colors that you like, then you're going to be able to pass in styling options at initialization. So once you have that, you're given a Fastlane object that really has those 4 modules. There are a couple other ones, but you get access to those 4 modules. Or you don't have to do any of that. You can just invoke the Fastlane constructor, and boom, you got the same exact thing. All right, so the identity module. So this is the first one that you're going to use, and you're going to use it to look up a customer by email. So you can see it doing lookup as well as authentication in the demo here. But the first thing you're going to do, you can pass it any email from maybe an input field on your page. Once you have that, you invoke the method. We go and look up and try to identify that email in our systems. So if we found and recognized that buyer, you get back a customer context ID. So this customer context ID allows you to know just one thing, whether or not we've identified the buyer. So you can put an if statement, something similar on line 7 there that says, OK, if we have a customer context ID, we've recognized the buyer, let's go through and authenticate them. So you can use the other method, trigger authentication flow. You pass in the customer context ID, and then we handle authenticating that buyer. We have their phone number. We open up a modal onto the page if it's desktop, a pop-up like this one if it's mobile. And we send them an OTP. They're able to autofill the OTP into the UI. And at the end of that, once they've authenticated properly, you get back an auth response. So this auth response contains 2 objects, 2 properties, an authentication state, which can be of one of 3 states, either succeeded, failed, or canceled. Succeeded and failed is pretty obvious. Canceled is if the buyer clicked out of our modal, closed the modal for whatever reason, or minimized it. That's the cancel state. So assuming that the buyer has successfully authenticated, you get back profile data. So this is us giving you the information, right? You can do what you like with that information. The buyer is authenticated. They've said yes to share my information with merchant. So you get back a shipping address, you get back a card. Now that's a tokenized card, it's not raw card fields. You get a payment token that you can then use to transact with. You get a name, so now you're able to go and paint the rest of your checkout UI. So coming to the profile module, now this is if the buyer has successfully authenticated, right? So you can use profile.show shipping address selector. What do you think that does? It opens up a shipping selector where the buyer can now change the shipping address that's in their profile. We just provide you the method, so you can hook this up to any button click event that you might have on your page. And it's a promise, right? So because it's a promise, when the UI is up, the promise is pending. Once it's resolved, it means the buyer has made a selection, and you get back the selected shipping address and whether or not the selection has changed. Same exact thing for our show card selector. It opens up a modal. We have the buyer's list of cards, and we allow them to change it. Now, both of those also have a button to add a card and add a shipping address. Again, we're handling all the shipping forms, all the PCI compliant card fields, all of that for you. At the end of it, at the end of the promise, once it's resolved, you can expect back a address and a card. So that's the profile module. And now we're getting to that payment component, right? So at this point, we've authenticated the buyer, or they're as a guest buyer. We've allowed them to change their address or their card if they like. And now we're getting to the piece of the payment component. So here what you're seeing is the payment component, that's the drop-in payment component, as a authenticated buyer, right? So we're now displaying the selected card, which last four is 1212. We have our PayPal branding, and then Visa card brand. Now this is that component that I was talking about, which just handles a tremendous amount of use cases. Some things like, hey, if you are a buyer that has cards on your profile, but none of them are accepted by this particular merchant, then we go and filter out the card list. We show the appropriate messaging, and then render card fields, handling all these different corner cases. If it's an unrecognized buyer, not authenticated, a guest, perhaps, then we're showing the card fields here. If you're also able to go and add a new card, you can add a new billing address. So if you maybe have a shipping address on your checkout page and you're passing that into our payment component, then we're able to show this checkbox that says, hey, use the same billing address as shipping. We already know what the shipping address is because you passed that in. All of these use cases are built into one component. So this is how you instantiate that component. Again, off of Fastlane, it's called Fastlane Payment Component, pretty straightforward. There's some options, and then you can also pass in that shipping address that I was talking about. That's going to give you an instance of the payment component, which then gives you the ability to call render. So in render, you give us a DOM selector, any container where you want us to go and render the component, and we're taking over that container and replacing the contents of that div. Cool. So this is that same exact payment component now, but rendering as a guest. So if you're using the identity module, and we weren't able to find a recognized buyer for that email, when you render the payment component, this is what it's going to show. It's going to show some card fields where they can enter their card details, as well as a checkbox for billing, same as shipping again. And then it gives them the ability to learn what Fastlane is, because this is a guest buyer. And they have the option to either toggle that on or off. Now, this is completely non-blocking, right? So if it's a bad phone number or something like that, we don't want to block checkout. That's the last thing we want to do. We don't want to slow the buyer down and present some error messages there. So we're saying, hey, here's an option. You can learn more about it. This is me going through changing the billing address manually. You see, we manage all of these different countries. These are regionalized forms. So we have client-side validation for all of these different countries and their forms, and we're basically just handling all of this for you, also handling all the errors for you. Cool. So I'm going to get into the card component now. So this is the one where I was talking about where it's a flexible integration. This gives you the ability to do everything on your own. We provide you the information to build your own UI. Then it's up to you how you want to render it. We do offer these card fields that allow you to do the same thing as the payment component in guest mode, where you have the card fields and then the consent component and the billing address. Cool. The one thing with the card component, though, you're going to be responsible then for rendering the selected card. What's really nice is the card selector, the one that we were talking about from the profile, whenever that changes in the payment component, it knows that, hey, the buyer selected a different card. So it's able to update itself. With the card component, this is up to you, right? Because it's a flexible integration. You can choose how you want to update and paint your own UI. So the only thing that we're managing is the guest fields. It offers the same exact configuration, so you can instantiate it using Fastlane card component, pass in a shipping address, and then call render on some kind of DOM selector that you pass us. All right, so now we've kind of walked through both different types of integrations. You can either do the quick start, which is the payment component, or the card component. Both of them offer a method called getPaymentToken. And getPaymentToken, what it's doing is tokenizing either the card fields, or if you're a logged-in buyer, then we have given you a nonce, and it's essentially also a token that you can then use to transact. So you have some kind of payment token from both of these methods. You're invoking this method when the buyer clicks your CTA, your checkout button, right? So you say, okay, card component, give me the payment token that's available. We go and we tokenize. We return you back a payment token that you can then transact with. Previously, we've already returned you a formatted shipping address. The reason why I say it's formatted here, it's a little bit of a detail, but I think it's important. I think it's the little things that make this really nice. We know which platform you're integrating on. So we know if you're coming using Fastlane on PayPal or Braintree. And we also recognize that Orders API and Braintree Transaction Sale APIs, they accept shipping address in a different way. It's a different shape of an address. So what we're doing is, because in Fastlane we know which platform you're on, when we return you a shipping address, when we're giving you the data, we're making sure that it's in the shape that you can then just pass it on and use it to your downstream APIs. So you can take the payment token, the formatted shipping address, pass it to your backend transaction server, and then use either PayPal Orders API or Braintree Transaction Sale APIs, and complete the transaction. So that's from start to finish of both flows, whether you're a guest or you're a logged in buyer, using Fastlane components to accelerate your checkout. So at this point, transactions are done. You've either invoked Orders API or Braintree Transaction Sale. So I want to take a moment and just talk about some cool features that I think would be important to highlight for Fastlane, right? So Fastlane offers this styling, this customization that like Karen was talking about earlier. You can pass in some background colors, some error code colors, font sizes, all these different things. We've kind of mimicked it to be similar as like CSS styles, and we use CSS variables to make sure that value gets propagated to the perfect spots in our entire code base. Likewise, you can also do that with the input fields, and that's what's kind of powering some of the UI that you're seeing here, where you're able to pass in a border radius, border colors, and all this to kind of theme the input fields to match other input fields that are already on your page. The really cool thing, though, again, it's the little things. The really cool thing is we even do contrast checking, right? So if you're passing in styles that may not fit the standard accessibility standards of the web, then we take the liberty of letting you know in the warning, in the console, throwing a warning in there that says, hey, this doesn't exactly meet standards. We're going to default the CSS styles to something that we know that works well. We give you this warning in your integration so that you can go and adjust it, right? So I'm going to just take a moment to give a huge shout out to Brian Hong. Brian, if you want to raise your hand. For owning this feature, he's done a tremendous job thinking about all the little pixel perfect places where we need to pass these variables. So if you have any more questions on styling and customization, you can talk to him after. Cool. So robust exception handling, right? So exceptions are going to happen. We're going to do our best not to gracefully fail or to gracefully fail, but they're going to happen, and we want to be able to communicate them. So when we were designing our standardized errors, we wanted to focus on what actionable step can our integration engineers take from the errors that we throw, right? So if some exceptions are happening, what actionable step can an integration engineer take to recover from Fastlane's errors, right? Remember, the number one rule is not to prevent a buyer from checking out. We want to accelerate it if we can, but we do not want to block the buyer at any cost. So internally, what we do if we encounter any error, throw an exception internally, we try to fall back to basic card fields. We do this gracefully. You won't even recognize it. We'll know because we're tracking that, but the buyer won't see anything differently. But even in some cases, we may not be able to handle that. So how do we throw an exception that allows you, as an integration engineer, to know exactly what is going on, right? And this is where we came up with some actionable exceptions. And how do we communicate these back to our integration engineers so that they know how to react to them? So this is what we came up with. It's an extension of the browser error class. We call it the Fastlane error internally, but it gives you a message that lets you know what's going on. So in this case, an initialization is failing due to an invalid authentication token. Where it happened in the process, like what's the source of that, right? The source is initialization. The type of error that's happening, it's an integration error because we're not able to use a proper authentication token. And then a standardized code. So it's FL init I01 in this case. Now this is perfect because you can use this code, you can put it in Stack Overflow, maybe someone else has encountered it before, they know how to handle it and they can give you suggestions, or maybe you can post it on Stack Overflow. So this is one way that we want to create some actionable steps that you can take to kind of recover and know what's going on in the checkout flow and things to look out for. Another shameless plug, shout out to Z Abrahams for owning the exception handling and designing all of our standard errors. She's figured out exactly where things can go wrong and what errors should be thrown when they do. Awesome. Okay, this is one of my favorites, multi-page checkouts. You don't see them too often these days, but they are there. So we need to handle them. So we have built-in session handling into Fastlane SDK. There's another use case that comes up, and we've all done this. You're checking out, and you have a list of products in your product cart, and you're like, oh, wait, I need to add one more thing. And then you go back to the product page, and you go back, and you add something, and you come back. Well, we want to make sure that when you come back to that checkout page, we're not authenticating you again, right? You're not sending another OTP to make sure you are who you say you are. So in this case, we manage the session for you. So once it's authenticated, we have some session handling built into the browser that we're using then to recognize you the next time you land on that checkout page. From the merchant integration standpoint, you don't have to do anything different. You continue to call the two methods available to you. You look up a buyer. If it's the same email that we've previously authenticated, then we know. You call trigger authentication flow. Trigger authentication flow is smart enough to recognize if there's an active and valid session. And if there is, then it's able to go and fetch that profile data and return it back. It's a promise, so it kind of does the same thing. But it won't show the OTP modal. It won't try to send an OTP to the buyer, nothing else. It just returns back the profile data, just seamlessly behind the scenes without the buyer knowing anything that's going on in the internal workings. So this solves the two use cases for us, right? Like multi-page checkouts can be supported now, and we don't need to keep OTPing you every time you come back to that checkout page. All right, and all of this, everything that I just talked about is delivered through the same two SDKs that you're already familiar with, that you're already integrating with, our PayPal JS SDK and our Braintree Web SDK. So PayPal has the concept of PayPal components. So we added Fastlane component. Braintree has modules. They have Braintree modules. We added a Fastlane module. Now, we provide both of these SDKs with a Fastlane loader, and the loader points to the latest static asset of the Fastlane SDK. So here, we're now able to get Fastlane to be evergreen regardless of what delivery mechanism that we want to offer. PayPal is already evergreen. Braintree is version controlled. The Braintree module is version controlled, but the SDK remains to be evergreen because of this loader pattern. And I just thought that was really cool. So you get the Fastlane, and then you get access to all the modules that we were talking about, and then you can continue to check out. All right, so how do you get Fastlane from PayPal v5 SDKs? Well, two steps. Something that you may already be familiar with, you're getting a client token on your server side, right? You're making this call to get an OAuth 2 token. You're passing in some values like your client ID and secret. One other important thing here for Fastlane specifically, you're telling us which domains that you want to render our checkout components on. So that's what line 10 is doing. Example1, or example.com and example2, those are the domains that our Fastlane components will render on with this client token. It's a security measure, right? So we don't want them kind of rendering on anywhere but those places that you tell us. So that's what we've built in. Secondly, once you get a client token, then you can just add a script tag for the PayPal JS SDK. Pass in the client ID that you have, and then your SDK client token, and then the components is Fastlane. And that's it. There's also this client metadata ID, which is kind of like a session ID that we use. So that is optional. You can pass that in if you have it. Otherwise, we'll generate one for you, and that's it. Then you have access to window.paypal.fastlane, and you can instantiate the constructor, and you're good to go from there. All right. Last but not least, Fastlane via Braintree SDK. This works in the same exact fashion. There's a server-side piece where you're getting a client token. Braintree has numerous languages that they support, so they have SDKs for Java, Go, Node.js. Here I'm using Node.js. There's a ton others. In this example, you are trying to instantiate Braintree Gateway, and then using that gateway to get a client token. And then again, you're passing in domains on line 16 here. At the end of that flow, you get a client token that you can then pass to your client side and instantiate Fastlane. So the 3 script tags that you need for the Braintree SDK, if you're familiar with Braintree modules, you know that you have to instantiate the Braintree client. So that's first and foremost. You get the Braintree client, you get Fastlane module, and you get a data collector module. So you'll pass the client token that you got from your server side into instantiating your Braintree client, and then pass your Braintree client into a data collector. You get a data collector instance, and you pass both of those into Fastlane. And so there you have your authorization token on line 22, passing in that client token, passing in the Braintree client instance, and then device data. And you've initialized Fastlane, and you're good to go again. Cool, so I've talked a lot. I hope you were still with me, and I hope this gave you a really good glimpse into all the meticulous care and thought the team has put into Fastlane, right? So we've walked through the entire flow. We've walked you through some cool features. And I just want to give a quick shout outs to the absolutely brilliant engineers, designers, product team, leadership, and time that everyone has taken to kind of think through all the corner cases, every which way that this thing can go wrong and right, and we've packed it into one SDK and one product. So I hope you're excited. I know we have some code lab sessions later on where you can try out everything that I just talked about. But for now, to walk us through the rest of the program, please welcome Mudita, Senior Director of Developer Experiences.